August 19th, 1953. Tehran, before dawn. A car moves through streets that haven't fully woken up yet. No diplomatic plates, no markings of any kind. Inside sits an American. His name is Kermit Roosevelt II, grandson of Theodore Roosevelt, CIA officer, 36 years old. His briefcase contains cash. His mission is exactly one thing: use that money to change the political outcome of Iran. The operation has a code name, Ajax. The budget is $100,000. 72 hours later, the mission is complete. Iran's first democratically elected prime minister, Mohammad Mossadegh, is dragged from his home by soldiers and hauled before a military tribunal. Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi boards a private plane in Rome and flies back to Tehran, where he steps onto a red carpet and reclaims his throne. American oil companies receive 25% of Iran's oil extraction rights. Back at Langley, the file gets stamped. Success. They got the accounting right. They got the definition of success completely wrong. To truly understand the seriousness of this matter, you need to sit down and take a close look at the bill. Not a bill in the figurative sense, but an oil contract. In 1908, a British businessman named William Darcy turned a concession in southwestern Iran's Khuzestan province into something real. Oil came shooting out of the ground. The Anglo-Iranian Oil Company was born, functioning as a direct extension of the British Crown and British national interest. The terms were written into a contract, black and white. Iran receives 16% of the profits. 16. Then, in 1950, an independent external audit finished its work. The numbers were laid on the table. The conclusion was this: in a single year, the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company paid more in taxes to the British government than it had paid to Iran in royalties over the previous decade combined. That number was read aloud on the floor of the Iranian parliament. And when it was, Mohammad Mossadegh stood up. There's a persistently repeated, persistently wrong narrative about who Mossadegh was, and that narrative was never accidental. In Washington's official framing, he was portrayed as unstable, as a potential Soviet fellow traveler, as a dangerous figure who could flip toward Moscow at any moment on the Cold War chessboard. He wasn't a communist. The CIA's own internal assessments confirmed this. He personally signed the orders to arrest Iranian communist organizers. He had a law degree from Europe, believed in constitutional process, and had spent 30 years advancing his political agenda through parliamentary procedure rather than street movements. If you lay out his political record on paper, he almost perfectly matches the profile of the kind of leader Western democracies claimed they wanted to cultivate in the Middle East. Secular, rational, proceduralist, someone who believed law comes before power. So what exactly did he threaten? Not democracy. He threatened a contract. He read the bill, and then he got Parliament to vote through the Oil Nationalization Act. Britain's response was nearly immediate. Naval blockade, international oil embargo, evacuation of all diplomatic personnel from the Tehran embassy, a coordinated international isolation campaign. Then London turned to Washington. The intelligence brief the British brought to Washington had exactly one structural argument: Soviet threat. Mossadegh's instability would create a vacuum for Soviet penetration. The Persian Gulf would change color. The entire Middle Eastern energy order would collapse. This case had almost no substantive intelligence to support it. British analysts knew this themselves. But it didn't need to be true. It just needed to make a superpower already running hot with Cold War anxiety. Imagine a specific possibility, the kind of possibility that sounds like, what happens if we don't act? The men who gave the final approval had intelligence reports sitting on the table, reports assessing Mossadegh's political identity. The conclusion was clear: not a Soviet asset. They read it. They approved the operation anyway, which means the Cold War threat wasn't the real variable in this decision. It was the packaging. The real variable was an oil contract, and inside that contract, a number, 16%. Overthrowing Mossadegh was just the beginning. The Shah came back. Shah Reza Pahlavi stepped off his plane at Mehrabad Airport and onto that red carpet. And from the very first day, he was operating inside a structural trap that had no clean exit. His throne had been restored by Washington, not through any political process, not through popular support, by a covert American operation, which meant his legitimacy, at its root, depended on continued American endorsement, and any signal that he wasn't in control, any sign of weakness, any hint that the investment was shaky, was an open invitation for his sponsors to reconsider the arrangement. A government that survives on external endorsement has one internal logic: demonstrate control, constantly, loudly, to prove it deserves that endorsement. In 1957, he created Savaq, the National Intelligence and State Security Organization, built with CIA assistance, technically trained by Israeli Mossad. Savaq's interrogation rooms became some of the deepest political scars in Iran's modern memory. But the targets Savaq went after weren't random. They were precisely calibrated. The primary target was not the obvious revolutionaries or radical agitators. Those people had never believed in the system to begin with. They were already outside it. Suppressing them didn't change anyone's political math. Savaq systematically eliminated the moderates. Iran sits at the intersection of three strategic pressure zones. To the north, thousands of miles of Soviet border. To the south, the oil-soaked Persian Gulf coast. To the west, a historically unstable buffer zone. Through the Strait of Hormuz, at its narrowest, just 20 miles wide, flows roughly 20% of the world's oil supply. You can theoretically swim across it. The strategic value of this real estate was understood by anyone in Washington with a map on their wall. Manageable was the most expensive word in this region, and the price of management was being paid one person at a time. Shapur Bakhtiar, one of Mossadegh's most important political allies, was a secular liberal nationalist and a graduate of the University of Paris. He believed in parliamentary democracy and opposed any form of religious interference in government. After the 1953 coup, he neither fled nor took up arms. He chose to remain in Iran and pursue reforms through legal means. He was arrested, released, and arrested again. Every moderate effort was nipped in the bud before it could yield any results. Secular Democrats were either exiled to Paris or had gone permanently quiet. Liberal nationalists had lost every institutional foothold they'd ever had. The people who believed constitutional reform was possible. Their political space had been compressed to zero, not by a single event, by 26 years of precisely targeted pressure, draining the space slowly until there was nothing left. This is not the starting point of the 1979 revolution. This is its precondition. Once a political ecosystem has been systematically cleared of every force that still believed the system could work, the only question left worth asking is, who remains? And why was it inevitable that it would be him? In those years, the one organizational network that hadn't been fully infiltrated, hadn't been fully suppressed, wasn't universities, wasn't trade unions, wasn't underground political parties. It was the mosque. You cannot use secular state power to close mosques, just as you cannot issue administrative orders to shut down collective memory. Prayer is a daily occurrence. It is a legally protected right. It is something even Savaq couldn't technically criminalize. After every other political space had been cleared out one by one, the mosque became the only place left with a legal right to assemble, the only place left with organizational capacity, the only place left where speech was still possible. When lawyers and constitutionalists were being imprisoned or pushed to Paris, the voice that remained in country, the voice that could still speak publicly, the one that thousands of people gathered every Friday to hear, was a different kind of voice entirely. Khomeini was not the natural winner of some inevitable ideological wave. He was the last man standing in a political ecosystem that had been systematically cleared. The 1953 coup didn't conceptually create the Islamic Revolution, but it spent 26 years methodically removing everyone who could have competed with it, everyone who could have offered a different political outlet, everyone who could have given the furious crowds on Tehran streets in that bitter winter of 1979 a different name to chant. The CIA won that coup. They won 26 years of surface-level stability. Then 1979 arrived, and they had to reckon with what they'd actually built. They had carefully, precisely eliminated every person who might have been able to catch that revolutionary energy and redirect it somewhere else. This is not historical irony. This is a mechanism, a complete, nameable, traceable mechanism. They thought they were clearing the field. They were planting something, and what they planted, no negotiating table has been able to pull out in the 50 years since. Not fate, not a clash of civilizations, a bill that was never settled. Kermit Roosevelt quietly left Tehran a few days after the coup. Years later, he wrote a memoir. The tone was breezy, the kind of book that reads like a recollection of an adventurous business trip. He died in 2000. The public record contains no expression of regret. Mossadegh stood trial before a military tribunal. He spent the last 13 years of his life under house arrest. No travel, no contact with political figures. The man who had appeared on the cover of Time magazine as Person of the Year gradually disappeared from the international eye. He died in 1967 at his estate in Ahmadabad. The Iranian government refused to authorize a public funeral. Per his wishes, he was buried in a room inside his own home. In 2013, 60 years after Operation Ajax, the CIA declassified a document formally acknowledging its role in the 1953 coup. The language was diplomatically careful. No conclusions, no evaluation, nothing approaching regret. Just a confirmation that this had happened and that they had been involved. It was filed into a database. On the day it was released, it didn't make the front page of most major news outlets. The Strait of Hormuz is still 20 miles wide. Nuclear negotiations continue. Sanctions lists are still being updated. Red lines are still being drawn. On the streets of Tehran, some people can still call out Mossadegh's name, saying he represents the direction from which the country was taken, then lower their voices, then fall silent. If you search through some archive somewhere in Tehran, among those yellowed folders, you'll find a bill from 1953. The amount is small, $100,000. The bill was never settled.